Welcome back, Biology 104. Today we're going to be covering our class Amphibia notes. This would be the slimy, scaleless ones. So the remaining classes belong to the superclass Gnathostomata. They have jaws, and that's what we're going to see with our amphibians. There are three orders that belong to the class Amphibia. We'll have Gymnophiona, order Anura, and the order Caudata. For the Gymnophiona, it's going to be the Caecilians. The Anura is going to be the frogs and the toads. And then the Caudata is going to be the salamanders and the newts. So we'll go through each of these. So for amphibia, here's some images of some different amphibians. We have Caecilians down here and our frogs and salamanders. When you hear that word, amphibian, that comes from a Greek word amphi, which means double, and bios, which means life. So if you literally translate the Greek, it would be living a double life. And when you look at amphibians, that refers to their ability to live on both land and in water. So they live two lives, especially when you look at metamorphosis. For example, from a frog egg to a tadpole to where it becomes more terrestrial or semi-aquatic. It's living two lives in one life. The earliest known use of the word amphibian in English was in 1637 by a Church of Scotland minister and theologian named George Gillespie, which is pretty neat. So the characteristics of our amphibians. They are thought to have evolved from lobe-finned fish. And we'll show you some body plans of those compared to early amphibians to show you some of the similarities. And they're thought to have adapted to be terrestrial. However, they do still have to lay their eggs in water. They have a bony skeleton with 4 limbs. There are exceptions to this. The exceptions to the 4-limbed amphibians would be the Caecilians. They are completely legless. They have no legs at all. And then salamanders could have vestigial or reduced limbs. But most amphibians are going to be tetrapods, which would be 4 limbs. Now, the respiration will occur through the gills during their development, but as they become adults, they will use lungs. Or, sometimes in addition, they can breathe through their skin, and they call that cutaneous respiration. The young pass through a larval stage before metamorphosing into the adult form. And we'll look at all those stages. They are ectothermic, which means they are cold-blooded. And our ectotherms, they do not produce enough body heat. They have to rely on the environment to regulate their body temperature. What we also see with reptiles. They have a 3-chambered heart, and they have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. They have pulmonary veins. So once blood goes to the lungs to become oxygenated, it has to travel back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, and that allows for the oxygenated blood to be pumped to the tissues at a higher pressure, which is an advantage for these organisms. Amphibians do something called brumation, and so basically like in the winter, what do frogs do when the environmental conditions get so cold? Well, it's different from hibernation. It's called brumation, and we'll talk about the differences. But basically what they do, similar to hibernation, is they might just burrow underground until they get under the frost line. Or they might, if you're looking for a frog in the winter, there might be a huge pile of decaying leaves. And at the very bottom of that pile, there might be a brumating frog at the very bottom. Or maybe if there's like a rotten tree that a bunch of beetles have gotten into, it might be inside there somewhere. So they find all kinds of places to stay warm during the winter. And they stay very dormant during that state. They'll absorb oxygen through their skin, even in the water, because some of these frogs will burrow in the mud at the bottom of a pond. And they're still able to breathe through their skin in that state. So they enter into this more dormant state, which is pretty cool. Some of them can even survive, like you see here in this bottom image, being partially frozen. Part of their body can be frozen, and they will still live through the winter. Some of them will get trapped under frozen ice, and they'll still be able to survive. So very resilient. Some of the differences between brumation and hibernation, because those are technically two different things when we talk about hibernation in mammals. For brumation, basically what they do is they're conscious. They're not in like a deep sleep state, and they're able to move around. They just don't move around very much. And they call this overwinter or overwintering. And they'll get a little overwintering site, like we mentioned, and they might emerge during that state because they're still conscious. They're still, aware. They're just at a very low metabolic state. So they might get up and get some water. Don't usually eat. They rely on a lot of their fat reserves and even muscle glycogen reserves to feed themselves. But they can go out and drink water because they will lose water. There's a lobe-finned fish on the top image and then an early amphibian on the bottom image. And you can see the bone structures are very similar. They still have jaws and these appendages that look very similar to legs. So for our order of Gymnophiona, that's going to be our caecilians. You might mistake these for like an earthworm or maybe even a snake, but these are different. They are limbless, and they do have jaws and teeth, which would obviously differentiate them from an earthworm. Usually blind, but possess sensory tentacles around the eyes and the nostrils. Tropical, and they like to burrow into the ground. Their name comes from a Latin word cecus, which means blind. So caecilian refers to their blindness. Now, they're not all like completely blind. I'll show you this image here. They might actually have eyes still, but if they do, they are very, very small, and they look like just a little gray bump like you see in this image. And they're usually actually covered by their skin and may even be covered by a bone. So they don't really do much other than they might be able to detect the presence of either light or dark. So they'll be able to do that. So a very simple eye. And that can be beneficial for them. And there's actually a benefit to losing eyes for their lifestyle, because eyes require lots of energy. So they would actually have to eat a lot more to power their eyes if they had fully developed eyes. So it allows them to save energy, and they actually prioritize their other senses, like touch and chemosensation and things like that. Our next order is called Data. It's going to be your salamanders, newts, and mud puppies. They have 4 limbs and a tail. They have 4 toes on their front legs and 5 toes on their hind legs, and they do not have claws. This is the caudata. They have internal fertilization without copulation. The males produce a spermatophore, which is a little packet of sperm, and they drop it, and then the female picks it up and places it into her body, and that's how they reproduce. So it's still internal fertilization, but there is no copulation. Some special examples in salamanders, we'd have the mud puppies, the axolotls. They exhibit something called paedomorphosis, or neoteny, which is where they retain their larval characteristics even as an adult. So rather than going from gills to lungs, they will just maintain their gills as they become adults. So here's a salamander and a lizard. You can tell their skin is much different. Lizard's going to be scaly and dry. A salamander is going to be moist. And the number of toes on the forelimbs for salamanders, they'll have 4, and on the hind limbs they'll have 5, and in the lizards they'll have 5 on the forelimbs and 5 on the hind limbs. So those are 2 major differences to tell the difference between a salamander and a lizard. And about 2/3 of salamanders are actually lungless, and they will breathe exclusively through their skin and the mucous membranes in their mouths and throats. But about 1/3 will actually have lungs. The axolotls, this is what they look like. They actually retain their external gills. They have a large tail fin, and they generally have a larval body shape as adults. So they never fully metamorphosize or metamorphose. And they keep those juvenile characteristics throughout their entire lives. And that's what we were talking about with that neoteny term. Mud puppies are named for the sound they make, which some say resembles a dog barking. Axolotls are named after Xolotl, which is the Aztec god of fire, lightning, and deformities. And it was believed that he could transform himself into a salamander, which is where that name axolotl comes from. And again, there's that image where you can see the 4 toes on the forelimbs and the 5 toes on the hind limbs. Here's what we're talking about with that reproduction and sexual reproduction in salamanders, where the male is dropping a spermatophore that you see here, and then the female follows closely and grabs the spermatophore and puts it into her body to fertilize her eggs. Here's metamorphosis in salamanders. So we see stage 1, it's going to be a jelly mass. So this mass of eggs is laid in an aqueous environment. And then if we took one of those, that's what one egg looks like on stage 2 there. And then 3, eventually the larva salamander or the tadpole will arise. And then you get these various stages of metamorphosis as the larva advances and develops and the limbs develop. It'll eventually grow its legs, its gills, fin-like structures will slowly be reduced until you get the adult. So amphibian, living 2 lives. And the eggs for the salamanders and frogs and amphibians, their eggs have a nutrient-rich yolk. And that is what provides the food for the embryo, even through the tadpole stage. So they actually don't necessarily need to eat immediately. They'll be able to live on that for a while until eventually they start to forage for their own food. Some parents, like for frogs example, when their offspring are in the tadpole stage, they'll actually go bring food to the tadpole. There's actually a video, if you go to Canvas and watch this, or open up this PowerPoint at the end, there is a link to a video that keeps up with that, which is pretty cool. So pedomorphosis in salamanders. Some species of salamanders retain some of their larval characteristics as adults, and that's what we call pedomorphosis. The mud puppy will retain its gills and tail, but has legs, so it retains some of those characteristics. And there is a species of mud puppy in Alabama that was considered endangered. I need to check on that now, but at one time it was. Giant salamanders do exist in China, and they can be as long as 4 feet. There's an image here of someone holding a giant salamander. Can you imagine what that, mucusy, slimy skin would feel like if you've ever held a salamander? Imagine one 4 feet that you can barely hold in your arms because it's so large and heavy. That does exist. For metamorphosis, what we're going to see is for the larval stage. What are the characteristics versus the larva and the adult stage? Well, for larvae, they're going to have a presence of a tail. The larvae are going to feed as herbivores, so they're going to be eating off plant matter. And for their respiration, they're going to have gills. So this would be for frogs, for example. And in the adult form, they lose the tail, so they do not have a tail anymore. And they move from being herbivores to carnivores. Adult frogs are going to be carnivorous. And the respiration will move from gills into the adult form. They will have lungs and also through breathing through their skin. So here's what that metamorphosis looks like for frogs and toads. So again, you have this jelly mass. Then you get, if you take out one of those fertilized eggs, the embryo develops. It might be attached to an aquatic plant, or as the tadpole hatches, it may be feeding on the aquatic plant. And then you have all these intermediate stages where you get, an early tadpole. It'll have external gills. Then the tadpole will develop internal gills. And then it will get hind legs. Then it will get forelimbs. You'll notice the tail shrinks. And then eventually you get what's called a froglet, which is basically an adult frog, but it still has a bump for its tail, a little remnant tail. And then you get the full adult frog. And in your notes, there are 4 of those to identify, and that is provided here for you. So for the order Anura, that's going to be your frogs and toads. Some of them also contain poison glands, and they call these parotid glands. Depending on the species, they could be, fatal or to mildly toxic, just depends. But they can be very dangerous. So an example would be the dendrobotid frogs, and they are extremely poisonous. Their poison affects the neuromuscular junction, which is how our neurons interact with our muscles. So if you disrupt that, then you can stop any process that it needs that. And that would include respiration, because your respiration is controlled by your diaphragm, which is a muscle. Now it's autonomically controlled, and also you can control it as well. But if you disrupt that connection, that junction, then you can stop respiration and you go into respiratory arrest. They exhibit external fertilization with something called amplexus. So what happens is, the fertilized eggs, as they are being laid, the male fertilizes them with sperm as they are being released into this jelly mass that is produced. And then, of course, the males, you think about the frogs at night in the summer, their vocalizations are used to attract their female partners. And again, there's what it looks like with the 4 toes on the front and the 5 toes on the back. And in some of these species, they can have claws. And here's an image of amplexus. You'll notice the male is on top, it's much smaller, and the female is on bottom. We see this with frogs and toads. And that's an example, that size difference itself is an example of sexual dimorphism. So for that embrace, as the female is releasing her eggs, when the male attaches to the female, that's what actually stimulates the eggs to be released. And as they're released, the male maintaining this close proximity is what allows the sperm to reach the eggs in the water, and then that leads to fertilization. This could last for several hours to several days. They could be in a state of amplexus. So here's just some images of metamorphosis. There's the jelly mass. Here's if you zoom into those individual eggs and you see the developing embryo in there. Then you get to a tadpole, and then all the intermediate stages as it becomes an adult. So here's what some of those poisonous frogs look like. Some of them are actually poisonous if you see this coloration. Some of them are mimicking the poisonous frogs through their coloration. But really, I wouldn't take my chances. It could be so poisonous that just touching them to your skin could kill you. At the end of this PowerPoint has a couple videos I would recommend going to Canvas to watch. But that is our amphibian notes.